Should we get started now, Edison, or wait?
Sure, go ahead.
All right. Welcome to another of our Perspectives webinars from AirInsight Group. Today's topic is the 737 MAX. Are we approaching the end of the tunnel? And what's the future for this airplane? And what are the challenges that the industry faces in bringing it back into service, and the complications thereof? We've got a great panel today with perspectives, and I think we'll gain a good understanding of where we are today and how far we still need to go. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists, and hopefully we'll have a great discussion about the MAX. Today's panel includes Ben Baldanza. Ben has been an industry executive for many years, was president of CEO of Spirit Airlines, held executive positions with U.S. Airways, Aviation, and Continental. He's currently on the board of directors of JetBlue and Six Flags, and an adjunct professor of economics at George Mason University on top of that. So Ben has very little time in his life, and we appreciate the hour he's going to take with us today. I know he's got a hard stop at 1 o'clock, so we'll make sure that we get him onto his next event, but one of the busiest guys we know. Thanks for being with us again, Ben.
Thank you.
Ron Epstein is a senior equity analyst at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, where he's been for just about 20 years now, or 19 years, Ron. Prior to that, he was an applied research scientist at Boeing. He holds a doctorate in mechanical engineering from Duke, an MBA from Wharton, and a diploma to engineer from the Von Karman Institute. So we've got a guy who understands both the financial and the technical parts of the world quite well in Ron. Thanks for being with us.
Happy to be here.
And Eddy Pieniazek is head of analytics and advisory at Ishka Aviation Finance, which provides advisory services for the air finance community. Formerly, he was with his own consulting firm, Ascend and Airclaims. He holds a degree from the University of London and is well known throughout the industry. Thanks for being with us, Eddy.
No problem. Thank you for having us.
And thanks for being on late from the UK. So we want to talk about the 737 MAX. It's been on the ground for 18 months. When is it going to return? How successful will it be? How does the current pandemic impact the market? Some of the challenges. We've seen the cancellation numbers this year. Will passengers accept it? And does Boeing need to change its time frame for a MAX replacement as a result of all of the activities, the two crashes, the groundings, and COVID, to really get a kickstart in the narrow body market space where it's lost market share? So those are some of the questions we'll be asking. And let's start with when do we think the MAX will re-enter commercial service? And how quickly will it be delivered to airlines? And how quickly will the built but not delivered airplanes get delivered in today's environment? Why don't we start with Eddy on that one?
All right, that's the big question. Well, I think all the indications are the end of the year is where we're looking at, I think, for redeliveries and starting service again. I would imagine there'll be a fair amount of effort put into getting the first aircraft flying again before the end of the year, so it becomes 2020 rather than 2021. And then from there onwards, I see a fair amount of ramp up in terms of aircraft being brought back into service. But it's going to be relatively slow paced and measured, I think. There's of there's 385 aircraft, I think, which had already been delivered. And I expect those to come back over the next couple of years. It's going to take a while. I think Southwest mentioned the other day that, to bring their aircraft back will take 3 or 4 months because there's going to be a fair amount of pilot training required and those kind of systems to get it back into place. So for the aircraft that have been built but not delivered, I think there's about 460 of those. And again, maybe over the next couple of years on a gradual pace, maybe split half and half between the next 2 years. And then you've got new production. which I guess will ramp up relatively slowly, because there's probably going to be some retrofit work on the existing aircraft, and I think Boeing just needs to pace it. And again, you know, the other feature is airlines' ability to take these aircraft as well. So I think the valves, you know, all those different scenarios, whether it's the already delivered or the ones that built but not delivered, and the new production, they'll all be, you know, tailored around, you know, the actual demand side of things as well.
Ben, your thoughts on those issues?
Well, I agree with everything Eddie said. And what I would add to that is, you know, there's a reason this was a really good selling airplane prior to the crashes, because it promised really good economics for airlines who would fly it in a very popular size category. And the reasons that it was popular before the crashes is the reason I believe it will be a popular airplane once it returns to service eventually as well. Although the reality of it is that the economics are going to be a little bit different. For airlines that have bought the plane already, when it comes back into service, it's going to be a little bit different plane than the one they bought in terms of its economic profile. The pilots are going to need more training. They'll need simulator time, which wasn't originally part of the training protocol for that airplane. And for the planes that have already been sold and have been grounded as a result of the crashes, I'm sure the airlines with those airplanes are negotiating with Boeing as to who's going to pay for that pilot training. For future sales of the airplane, it's going to change the dynamics a bit of that plane versus the A320, which, as most of the listeners I'm sure know, that for pilots certified on the A320CO, it's relatively easy, no simulator training into the A320neo, and that has been the game for the A320neo, and it's been one of the reasons that plane is sold so well. So when the MAX loses that training advantage for new sales, I think they're going to have to push a little harder or maybe adjust their pricing a little bit against the A320.
Okay. Ron, any thoughts to add on that first topic?
Yeah, sure. Just quickly, I agree with both Eddie and Ben's comments. The one thing I might add, with maybe a little finer tuning it, in our own financial models, we're looking at the aircraft that are sitting in inventory to get delivered out in about 2.5 years, and then new production ramping up slowly from there. So we don't have, you know, the ramp on the MAX going up very quickly. Just because of the aircraft on ground. If you look at the 460 or so that have been built, plus the 370 or so that have been grounded, you add that all up. That's, if you think about it, just normalize it to 1 year. That's like 70 to 71 airplanes per month for a year. It's a lot of planes, right? So for the industry to absorb that in this environment, it's just going to take a while.
Okay, very good. Pilot training is certainly an issue, as Ben brought up. Do we have enough simulators in the world to make this happen in a reasonable time frame, and will that cause some constraints, especially at carriers like Southwest and Ryanair that rely on the MAX?
I can jump in quickly on this one.
Sure.
One of the companies we do follow is CAE. CAE is one of the manufacturers of those simulators. CAE was pre-building simulators actually before we went into the pandemic. You know, with the foresight that the industry would probably need more simulators because of how this was going to play out. I'm not close to it enough to know if they have built, you know, exactly enough, but they were forward-building simulators for the industry. So my sense is, if it is a bottleneck, it's not going to be a serious bottleneck, because at least one of the manufacturers of the largest manufacturer of flight simulators was forward thinking enough to be pre-building simulators.
Okay. One of the things we're hearing is that EASA and Transport Canada might each have some additional requirements for the airplane. They'll probably recertify it to enter service, but say we want some additional changes made later. The Europeans are looking at a third sensor, even if it's a synthetic software-based sensor, to take readings from other systems and double check to determine which of the other two sensors is likely to be right. And Transport Canada wants an off and on switch other than a circuit breaker for the stick shaker, which may sound like a simple modification, but isn't quite that simple when you implement it. Each of these things will take some time. Each of these things might result in different types of different configurations for the aircraft. Is it important that all of the aircraft be configured the same way? Do we want to see, quote, European aircraft versus US aircraft with that third sensor? And will that cause disruption in the market? Eddy, why don't you start with that one, and we'll go around the panel.
Yeah, I guess these guys need to talk to each other. You don't want to have different setups. I mean, we've seen it in the past where, different nations have different jurisdictions have different requirements in that sense. And it impacts on the value of the asset, the ability to, to be portable without any additional cost. So if you've got those kind of things hanging over your head, it complicates things. And I imagine, because of the thousands of Maxes that are going to be when deliveries restart, you need to probably have a more universal application in that sense. So I imagine they need to iron those things out. Otherwise, yeah, like you say, it gets complicated.
Ben, your thoughts?
Well, I think that's right. And again, it goes to the fact that the plane coming back in service is not the exact same plane that people were buying in droves before it was grounded, right? There are changes in the way this plane will fly. And pilots unions were all over this once the crashes happened, if we need to understand the system better. And that has been hopefully the new training protocol sort of address those things head on. The simulator time that people get, obviously you're going to need to have the software improvements to be able to model the way the new MCAS system works with the new 2 sensors and things like that, and make all that work. And again, what that means for an airline operating this plane, they're going to spend more money and more time bringing it back into service than they originally modeled when they looked at the whole economics of that airplane. And for the people who've already bought that plane, I'll say again, I'm sure they're talking with Boeing about covering those differences. But when it comes to selling that plane again, that's going to be a challenge for Boeing.
Ron, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, clearly I agree with both Ben and Eddy. I think Eddy's point about not having a regional variant, like you really don't want that. If it's some sort of subsystem that's really easy to change over, that's one thing. But when you're talking about something as fundamental as a synthetic third sensor or something else that is maybe more difficult to pull together, yeah, you really don't want to do that. And that makes a lot of things more difficult in the aircraft, and clearly it will impact residual values on the airplane for sure. I mean, that's about all I can add to that. Yeah.
Okay. From a market standpoint, I think, Ben, you mentioned that the things that made the MAX successful will be there, even though it's a little bit of a different airplane. We've seen about 1,000 cancellations now for the MAX, roughly over the last year and a half or so. Do you think those will come back once the plane gets in service? And what kind of a market do you see looking into the future for this airplane?
Well, as every airline is thinking about its fleet going forward and is looking at a world of lower demand for at least some period of time, and I'm sure every airline, and I see John Heimlich's on this call, he's got his own models that talk about how long it's going to take to get volume back in the industry. And if you think about it from an airline standpoint, if you're going to be flying a smaller fleet for some period of time, and you're concerned about getting yourself to cash neutrality or even generating cash at sometime soon, hopefully for the industry, you're going to want the most efficient airplanes you can have to do that. So I think once the MAX is back and the pilots are trained to fly it, the airlines that have it are going to want to put that plane in the air because it's going to be more efficient than other equipment they may have. It's going to burn less fuel. It's going to generate profits more quickly than older equipment they have. So given the size of this airplane, I mean, the size of the 737 family and the A320 family is far and away the most popular size of aircraft anywhere in the world. Most routes aren't the 14, 18-hour flights that we all celebrate. Most flights in the world are, 2 to 3 hour kind of flights. That's where most of the volume of flights are in the world, in that range. And this plane is going to be a very strong plane over the next 20 years, I believe. It's gone through a real tough year and a half here. It's going to be a rocky return to service with pilot training, with cancellations that have done. The cancellations that have happened, I think, will be replaced, not necessarily by the airlines that canceled those, but I think they'll get those back and more in terms of orders over time. But this is going to be, airplanes are 20, 25-year assets, and this plane's going to use the first 5 of its years getting itself back to a base case, I think.
Ron, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean the 737 MAX 8 in particular, if you compare it to its competing airplane from Airbus, it's got a smaller cross section, so therefore it's lighter, right? So from an operating perspective, it's I think by any stretch of the imagination, it's a more efficient airplane. So I would imagine, like Ben said, all the factors that were a tailwind for the 737-800 and the 8 MAX, they'll be there. Like everybody said, it's going to be a little more complicated when it goes back into service. Now, I think the rub becomes when you look at its little sister, or more importantly, its bigger sisters. They're more marginal aircraft than their competitors' airplane. So as a point design around the size of the MAX 8, it's a wonderful machine. And then its bigger sisters are maybe less wonderful just because they're more range constrained. So if you have an airline who's looking at a broader range of narrow body aircraft, the 8 might be less attractive than the lineup of both the A321, XLR, LR, A320 Neo family, right? So I think that's a bigger question. But in isolation, all else being equal, the MAX 8 should prove to be ultimately, I think, a very good machine in the market that it serves.
Eddy, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, we think that over the next 3 years, we'll probably end up with about 1,200 MAX in.
I think we've just had a
hiccup.
Just had our first
Looks
hiccup.
like his Zoom froze.
There we have a Zoom freeze for Eddy, but at any rate, let's then move on to the next question and hope he can reconnect for us. The impact of the pandemic. How long will the pandemic hurt aircraft sales? And what impact do we see the pandemic having on the MAX in the near term? Ben, why don't you start with that?
Well, sure. Obviously, I've been thinking a lot about this, and it's tough. I think a reasonable way to think about this is that that manufacturers are looking essentially at about a 3 to maybe 4 year pause in production. And that doesn't mean that they're going to stop producing in that time. But when you think about airlines that are deferring orders, in some cases canceling orders, pushing back deliveries because they don't want to take delivery of new airplanes when some of their fleet is still on the ground, and order books are being pushed out. When you think about it, an order that was all going to be delivered by 2025 now may take until 2028 until it's all delivered. So guess what? Boeing doesn't have to build more airplanes for that period. So the effect of all this, I think, for Airbus and Boeing is if you look over the next 10 years, they're going to produce about 7 years worth of airplanes instead of 10 years of airplanes, because it's just going to take time before airlines are going to be ready to start growing again. It's going to be years as they build back into some kind of volume base that existed before COVID. Now, that said, airlines are going to want more efficient planes than not, so the more efficient airplanes may come back a little sooner, and it may retire more quickly some of the older airplanes. And this size category of the MAX is the size category that is going to come back sooner than the longer haul wide body equipment also, I believe. So in that sense, you got good things going for this airplane. But I think the right way to think of it is that the precipitous drop in demand that is looking like a very slow recovery, and maybe till 2023 or 2024 before we're looking at volumes anything close to before COVID, means that the airlines aren't going to need as many airplanes, and that means the people who make airplanes aren't going to need to make as many for that time.
Okay, Ron, we heard Ben's estimate of about 70% over 10 years, or 7 years worth of airplanes over 10 years. Agree or disagree, and your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think about it maybe a little differently, but I agree 100% with that number. If you think about the estimates that you hear from IATA and other industry players, if we don't get back to 2019 air traffic levels until, call it 2023, 2024, well, then you don't need any growth for 3 to 4 years. And then it's just a replacement market. And then that replacement market is smaller than you think it is because you've got so many grounded aircraft. So just like Ben said, almost exactly, it's you have 3 to 4 years of aircraft that don't need to be delivered because of what's going on, because of how deep the hole is. But then when you get out beyond that, there'll be demand for aircraft. I think what makes what's interesting, unfortunate for the MAX, was the timing of the pandemic relative to the re-entry back in service and what was going on with the 737 MAX before this, right? I mean, the MAX as a program was flat-footed when the pandemic hit. So, if you're an airline, and Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, if your airplanes are at a year late or even more so, and you have a financial out, you have a material adverse change clause in your contract with the OE, you would be foolish not to exercise it in the current environment, because you can get out of the airplane without any financial impact. And then you actually have leverage on the other side if you want to get back into the airplane. So, I mean, anybody who could cancel it right now, who really doesn't need the capacity, who wasn't, kind of deep in pre-delivery payments, they would have been really, really foolish not to cancel them. So, the numbers of cancellations, I don't think ultimately are that surprising. And, if you look at the difference between the cancellations on the 737 MAX vis-a-vis, the A320, I mean, it's much more complicated on the A320, right? You don't have that out. But in the current environment, that's what you're seeing. And I think that's what puts that, the 737 at a much, in a different situation, at a disadvantage versus its competitor, because it went into this in a weakened position, right? So coming out of it, it's going to be more difficult. And that doesn't, I'm not saying it won't, right? I mean, everything we said in the previous question, it's a fine airplane, it'll serve its market well, but it really went into the pandemic very flat-footed.
Yep.
I agree with that. And I'd also like to say that there are some airlines in the world who use the delivery of a new airplane as a liquidity event. They buy the plane at a good price from Boeing or Airbus, make a deal with a lessor for a sales leaseback that they take delivery of the airplane and get a check for a couple of $1 million. It's going to be interesting to see the airlines that have counted on that as liquidity, whether that liquidity will still be available given sort of how the pricing of these planes is going to be reset given the demand environment, and whether or not sort of being able to take money away at the sale leaseback event is still going to be available. And if it's not, there are some smaller airlines in the world that are going to be really cash constrained because they count on that liquidity.
Exactly. That's an interesting point. One of the things that a lot of people don't mention is that when Boeing, when the MAX was grounded, they also suspended Boeing's production certificate for the 737 MAX. How long will it take for Boeing to get that back, and what are the implications there in terms of additional cost for Boeing on the production of the aircraft. And maybe Ron, who has the technical background, might be able to answer that question a little bit better.
I mean, it's hard to say exactly what the cost will be, but it will drive. I mean, in the current environment, it's probably not that big a deal. It'll drive slower deliveries, right? I mean, you're not controlling the airplanes coming off your line, and it's going to keep you focused on dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's and everything you have to do, which they should be doing anyway, right? And I would imagine, ultimately, right, it's going to come down to they just have to get the confidence of their regulator back again, right? And that's going to take some time. And given the current environment and the politics of the entire situation, I can't imagine that the FAA is going to be in any rush to do that. I mean, ultimately, I would imagine the FAA wants to get this off their plate, right? Because I mean, they're manpower constrained anyway. So I mean, this is just one more thing they have to do. But and what's the bogey? I don't know. A year and a half, 2 years. We'll see.
Sounds good. Well, thanks very much, guys. I'm going to have to disappear. Addison, I'm going to let you take over for Q&A and continue the discussion. Thanks for being with us, guys. Sorry, I have a 12:30 commitment that I need to get to in 3 minutes flat. So see you next time. Thank you.
All right, everybody. I'm going to start with the first question here. For carriers already flying the MAX, I guess, who had flown the MAX before the grounding, will pilot training really be an added cost when buying additional MAXs? Wouldn't that extra cost only affect planes sold to current non-MAX airlines? Anybody want to take a jump?
I'll address this. I mean, I talked about this a bit earlier. It will affect the airlines who already have the plane, who believe they had type certified pilots ready to fly the MAX, and now they're going to have to go through more training before they can safely fly that airplane. And for new buyers of the plane, I believe it will also be an issue because, again, you're going to be comparing an A320neo that has a relatively slim profile, non-simulator protocol training for the neo for A320ceo type rated pilots. And for the 737, you're going to be looking at additional simulator training, additional time, additional cost. Now, if you're flying the 737NG, then you're still going to have to train the A320neo pilots for the A320neo. So that's not going to make the neo an advantage. But if you're looking to try to convert players from Airbus into Boeing, this has become a lot harder as a result of this, I think. And if you're looking at a carrier that has both Airbus and narrow-body older generation airplanes, it makes the neo look a little bit better relatively.
Okay, by the way, to everybody in the audience, in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, please feel free to put in your questions. Okay, next question here. Relating to the pricing, do you see leasing market valuation dynamics influencing the MAX pricing? Seems like the additional training and unique return to service costs will influence individual airline MAX economics, but I would think the asset value as part of a larger market would be much more influential on OEM pricing. Any comment from the panel?
Yeah, I guess in terms of lease rates for the aircraft that are still to be delivered and maybe renegotiated, there's probably going to have to be some incentives to encourage that to go forwards, and for airlines not to step out away from their lease obligations. So yeah, I mean, there's probably going to be sort of two-tier leasing. I mean, there's the existing carriers who've got them, and if they're leased, then they'll probably have renegotiated those as well, or are certainly talking to their lessors. And then there's a number of unplaced MAXs, and I guess there'll be some incentives there and some encouragement to get people to take those airplanes. So low start rentals, etc. And it'll take a while for that to filter through. But it's not just a MAX issue. I think it applies to a lot of airplanes in terms of stimulating, interest in taking one aircraft over another. So yeah, I think near term there'll be some bargains out there, I imagine, with some of the unplaced or aircraft that have lost their customers.
Right.
And it'll take some time to work through, but it's a good opportunity for some airlines to maybe upgrade their fleets.
Right. Ben or Ron, anything you want to add to that?
I thought Eddie said it really well.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree. The only thing I would add is to the initial question that Ben answered. If you are an operator of a fleet of 737 NGs and that's all you have, and you were going to bring in the MAX under the understanding that you had interchangeable pilots, and now that you don't, that makes things more complicated. And to an airline that has a business model that's based on that simplicity, if you're going to bring in MAXs and it's going to require some different training and it's almost a different airplane type, why not look at a different airplane type? Just
we're not saying the word Southwest Airlines, but that's absolutely what jumps to my attention there. Okay, next question. With the OEM aircraft manufacturing sector essentially a duopoly, isn't the long-term outlook for the MAX still fairly strong? Can a single manufacturer handle the pent-up demand? Anyone?
I do think the longer term market for this airplane, the MAX, is strong. I think that the size of this airplane and the overall economics of the plane, even when you factor in more upfront training for the pilots and things like that, it's still going to be a great, single aisle, middle range kind of airplane for a lot of airlines all over the world. It is going to be strong, but it's going to take a few years, partially because of the MAX unique issues of bringing it back into service, and then the massive issue of just overall demand, and when demand comes back, that's unrelated to the MAX itself, of course.
Yeah, I mean, the market will, you need at least two players. The market won't allow just a single one. And the airlines will win, one will win one campaign, one manufacturer will win the other. And if, they were almost at 50-50 parity beforehand, okay, it's leaning towards the Airbus at the moment for, all the reasons we know. But, that means that Boeing will have to do some sweet deals to try and address that balance. The one thing you don't want is where you've got like a 70-30 or an 80-20 market split, because that can be harmful, I guess, to residual values. So, Boeing will be incentivized to make sure that doesn't happen.
But I think, I would add to your point, a 70-30 market split, a 60-40 market split, a 65-35 market split is, far from ideal for Boeing, right? And the 737 MAX by itself can't keep half the market, right? And if the market doesn't think the -9 or the -10 MAX are enough, it puts Airbus still in a better position. So it's, and Boeing's in a funny spot right now, right? Because, do they do something bigger? It's weird timing, right? Not just because of the balance sheet considerations of the company, but engine technology, when would they get leapfrog? Is this really when you want to do a new airplane? But, with a really good MAX 8 and your competitor just having a broader profile that maybe on average is seen as better, how do you compete against that?
Yeah. I guess it just points to the fact that Boeing has to do something, doesn't it, with a product line as a whole.
All right.
And I think the product line as a whole is important for Boeing, especially given what may be a reduced longer term demand for wide body, longer haul airplanes, which is where Boeing has held a long term advantage over Airbus. Yet that's the part of the business that is going to be the slowest in coming back, I believe.
Interesting. So the next question is something I've been waiting to see if somebody would pop this up, but here it goes. How does China and its recertification factor into the overall program trajectory for the Boeing Airbus single aisle dynamics globally? Go ahead, panel.
I'll kick it off. China has become a large player for a large end market for commercial airplanes, right? I mean, it's 25, 30% of the end market. It's a key market for the 737 MAX. It's a bit of an open question as to when the Chinese regulator is going to approve the MAX. I have no doubt that they will. I mean, the C919 is in no position right now to start delivering. So they're going to need the lift. Right, but it's, I think China's a key consideration. So until they have a how can I say it, a domestic product that could replace an A320 or a 737, they have to buy from those suppliers. And I do believe, right, you just saw the announcement recently, right? Boeing's got sanctions on it now from China, as does Lockheed Martin, as does Raytheon Technologies. I ultimately think, I'll say this in a public setting, that those are sort of toothless sanctions. You're not going to buy airplane parts from United Technologies. Good luck with that. You're not going to buy airplanes from Boeing and still try to grow your aviation market in the current environment. Yeah, good luck with that one too. And you don't buy anything from Lockheed Martin as it is, maybe one commercial helicopter a year. So, how those sanctions are positioned, I think are just, it's kind of bluster, but there's not much behind it.
Well, about a year ago, I went to before COVID, I went to a presentation where Airbus was, presenting sort of their global world outlook and such. And I think that presentation summarized the following. They basically said, we need to build airplanes for replacement for North America, and we're building all of our growth airplanes for India and China. And it was more complicated, but that was basically what they said. I don't think you can talk about the world demand for airplanes without including China in that, for the reasons that Ron said.
Yeah, there are used aircraft going into China at the moment. The appetite has rebounded. They seem to be well ahead of the rest of the world in terms of getting back to some form of normality or recognizable sort of market. They're going to need the aeroplanes, and again, having two manufacturers supplying is gives them that competitive edge as well in terms of pricing. So I don't see them stalling too much with the MAX certification. They need the aeroplanes.
All right, our next question is, we've kind of touched on this before, but I think it's an interesting one. Now that MAX is nearly ready to come back to service, will Boeing have to have an appetite to study new developments? And I think we've touched on that, but is Boeing's hand being forced here? And if we look at, we're up to now, we've always been thinking about 2030 as the next watershed moment for the next generation, single aisle. Now that we've had this pandemic and we've saying, well, we're going to lose 3 years, do we now look at 2035, 2033? And is Boeing's hand going to be forced despite the trouble everybody's in?
I think they need to do a product. Is it necessarily a clean sheet airplane? We'll see. I mean, conceptually, what would be ideal is a modern 757. Well, that doesn't exist. So what can get you there? Well, you could do it with a clean sheet, but then you have to consider what's going on with engine technology. Would you get leapfrog? Wouldn't you get leapfrog? You also have to consider the fact that do you really want to end up with the minority of market share in the narrow body market? I mean, it could very well end up being a 65-35 market split between Airbus and Boeing in the narrow body market. Do you want that? There are probably clever ways that you could make something like a 737 MAX yet more effective. So maybe you go down that path, or excuse me, the 737 MAX 10 more effective. So, you go down that path, you have to spend some money to do it. But, ultimately, difficult times drive difficult decisions. And, ideally, if you were to do a new product or a new derivative, you'd want it to hit the market when the market is getting better, right? You want to launch a product in a down market, right? Because it'll be there in the up market. You don't want to launch it in the up market because it'll come to market in the down market. So even though your balance sheet is stretched, Civil aviation is in the worst downturn in the history of mankind since we've been flying, right? Orders, an order of magnitude worse than anybody imagined. As crazy as it sounds, this is the environment where I think you have to be bold and think about, okay, what are we going to do? I mean, our core business, one of our core businesses, is developing, designing, building, and delivering commercial aircraft. So, go do it.
Yeah, I don't think the development of technology is going to stop. That's going to carry on at some pace, and I imagine this downturn is going to help accelerate some of that technology development because people will be looking for new ways of doing things and just improving what we've already got. So I don't see a next generation aircraft being delayed. I think that the timeline there still probably exists. We're just going to get there sooner, I think.
So up to now, well, we've always seen that engines drive the next airplane. But if you're in the engine business right now and you've been living on power by the hour, you're going on a radical diet. There's no power by the hour revenue. How do the engine makers fund the R&D for the next exotic things that are going to be necessary? The material testing, the myriad things to create this next generation engine that enables a new narrow body.
I'll jump in on that. This is where having a diversified stream of cash flows becomes really helpful. So if you're at Pratt & Whitney today, you're actually in a pretty good seat because over 55% of your parent company's revenue is defense revenue. That is generating cash, that has relatively deep pockets, and good technical prowess. So that's where it comes from. If your revenue stream is 100% commercial aero or near that, this is a painful time, right? Like I think you said it well. You're on a pretty serious diet. That said, however, this won't last forever, right? I mean, it just won't. 2023, 2024, if that is right, will be here sooner than we think. And from a technology development point of view, that's really not that far away. So you do the best you can in the current environment. And if you have to, I do believe you raise some capital to do some technology for the future, right? Because it's, this is temporary. It's going to be extended, but it's temporary.
Anything you want to add, Ben?
I agree that it is temporary. I can say though that the drop in that revenue stream for the power by the hour is significant, even for a Pratt. But you're right; they have deep pockets in other areas, and I'm sure those companies, just like Boeing and Airbus, and just like every airline, are thinking about prioritization and reprioritizing R&D, reprioritizing manufacturing, thinking, and everything in this environment right now. So it wouldn't surprise me if things are delayed a bit, but will it change the fundamental direction of where things are going? I don't think so. I agree with Ron.
Okay, just remind the audience, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. Next question, will the supply chain be resilient enough to not play a negative role in the 737 MAX manufacturing down the road?
Well, I think that's a very important question. That supply chain in particular has really gone through a tough time. That supply chain has had to deal with both the 737 situation, where the airplane will have been grounded not quite 2 years, but almost, right? A couple months short of 2 years. So that revenue got cut off, and then the pandemic on top of it. So if you're a supplier and your biggest revenue source was the 737, you're in a world of pain right now. So it's you're working with either your financiers or with an OE to try to survive this. The bigger, more diversified suppliers Not that this is fun, but they'll get through this. Most of them will anyway. But the smaller suppliers who are, very, very commercial aerospace oriented, and then on top of that, very tied to the 737, that'll be a problem. One of the things I worry about broadly is not just with the 737 program, but the industry writ large. Just today, Raytheon Technologies, I keep calling it United Technologies. Raytheon Technologies reported earnings, and they are reducing their workforce in their commercial business by 20,000 people. Okay, I mean, I understand why they're doing that, but when this does turn around, how hard is it going to be to bring people back? A lot of those are highly skilled folks, both engineering and on factory floors. And I know there's a balance and a tension between saving cost and being in this current situation, but I think an issue more broadly, not just for the 737, but for the entire commercial supply chain, is its health. And when things do ramp up, that the supply chain will be in condition to handle it. And the situation with the 737 just exacerbated it, because it's sort of a double whammy. It's pandemic plus everything that was specific to that airframe.
Ben or Eddie, anything to add?
No, I think Ron's summed it up perfectly there. They've got to raise the liquidity, they've got to cut their costs and map around, right sizing themselves for what's going to go forwards. And, if they're struggling, then hopefully the end user, the end OEM will help provide some kind of support.
It's amazing when one thinks about the skills involved in commercial aviation. I was looking at something this morning which was absolutely staggering. Pilots that a year ago were flying 380s for Qantas are now got jobs as bus drivers in Australia. That is staggering. Instead of driving this bus, you're driving another bus, but it's not the same thing. It is, I mean, can you imagine your career doing that? And of course, we went from a pilot shortage January, February. In March, we went to a surplus. And now, of course, they're getting, getting rid of the pilots in the union rules. The younger ones are getting furloughed. The older ones are staying. So we're seeing what kind of impact that's having on Delta and their 220 pilots, because now they have to park some 220s to get enough pilots to fly it, because they have to train the other guys. So this whole skill thing, not just on the supply chain, as Ron was saying, but across the whole operation, the skill adjustment is, I don't know how you undo this.
You make a great point, Addison. I co-host a weekly podcast, and one of our listeners wrote in and said, in 1 year, we've gone from planes without pilots to pilots without planes. and it's really amazing what's happened.
Wow. Okay, next question. What do you see changing in the services market, either related to MAX specifically or to COVID in general? Do you see any potential for power by the hour offerings like global fleet care?
I suspect a lot of people are looking at power by the hour as a temporary process and working its way back into some kind of a more structured lease agreements down the line. It would certainly change the whole dynamics of that whole leasing model if power by the hour became the norm rather than the outlier.
Mm.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, Eddy, but if you went by power by the hour as the new norm, the leasing would have to get more expensive per hour for it to make sense.
Yeah, and then nobody could afford it. So, it's that. How does that resolve itself?
Mm. Okay, given the fact that Ben has a hard stop coming up shortly, I'm going to have one more question here. Europe is pouring money into development of a sustainable zero carbon powered aircraft. The need for jobs of young engineers is being given as a driver. Small aircraft are typified by zero, Avia, etc., etc. Airbus is pushing airliner demonstrator H2 platforms and has provided a timeline for future programs. Boeing, question mark?
Well, I mean, ultimately they'll have to look at it too, right? I mean, if Airbus is on a path, and let's assume 2035 is when they can get a flying realistic prototype, and if it looks like it's a promising technology, that's something the industry will have to adapt to, and their primary competitor will have to adapt to. There's a lot of, as you know, open questions about hydrogen-powered aircraft. In particular, how you store the hydrogen it's heavy, right? I mean, not the hydrogen, but how you store it is. So, storage of hydrogen can be an issue. And if you try to do an electric aircraft, cooling can be an issue. It takes a lot of energy. So you got to cool, and cooling equipment generally is pretty expensive, or not expensive, but heavy. So there's a lot of open questions on it. But if it does seem like it's a fruitful technology, clearly that's something Boeing will have to look at. And under the natural course of just the evolution of the industry and technology, I think it's reasonable to assume that they will, right? And it's just, at this point, it's very, very early days.
I agree with Ron. I also look forward to a date, hopefully sometime soon, when we can argue about sustainability of the industry in environmental sustainability again, as opposed to talking about financial sustainability of the industry. If you look in 2019, if you look at conference decks and the ways airlines were talking about themselves and what their priorities were, you saw sustainability and reducing carbon footprint in a lot of these decks as a very important thing that a lot of the airlines were thinking about. My guess is all those same airlines today still care about that and still know it's important for the future of our planet and such, but they're focused on other things right now, staying liquid, figuring out how to keep their people employed, and how to emerge from this terrible pandemic strong enough to be able to have those kind of arguments again.
Eddy, I guess you have the last word today.
On that, I mean, it's a great place for young engineers to be playing in that space, whether it's electric or hydrogen or just taking the industry forward another step. So good luck to them. I hope they find something good.
That's great. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the panel today. Thank you to the audience for being here with us. And have a great day.
Yeah, you too, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all the other panelists, and thanks for everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.